And it got to the point where she was about 30 days away from giving birth, and she just said, you get to this home, we're buying it. So I turned up, registered, and the first bid that got thrown out exceeded my budget by about $50,000. So you get in the car, and I knew I was going to cop it, and I did. So I bring up realestate.com, found a home. I was like, auctions in half an hour, let's go here. Got there late. I literally walked through the backyard, under the house. It was a Queenslander that had been raised but hadn't been built in under. Walked through the house into the backyard. He gave me my ticket, and I just stood in the backyard with my hand up until I bought it.
Drew Davies from Place Real Estate Agency in Ascot, I think.
That's right.
How you going, mate?
Very well. Very well.
So, I get this unbelievable feeling of confidence from you. So where the hell did you get it from?
I don't know, mate. Maybe it's false confidence. I don't know.
No, where's your background? What's your background?
Grew up in New Zealand. Moved to Brisbane in 2008. And then got into real estate maybe, 8 years ago? And have been a director alongside my business partner, Patrick McKinnon, at Place Ascot for 3 years.
Yeah, so 8 years in the real estate.
In real estate.
And you've got a big following on Instagram too.
Big following on Instagram. Yeah. That's how I built it. I mean,
how did you do that?
I guess my entry into real estate was not an easy one. I didn't even have a car at the time, so I ended up selling apartments that I could walk between. And not having money, I guess, or any, it really came down to money. I didn't have any money to market myself. The easiest way to do that at the time was on these social media platforms that hadn't really got a lot of momentum, especially with real estate agents. So that's all I'd do. And at the time, I could afford a coffee in the morning, and I'd take a photo of my coffee. Literally, that's how it started, coffee and socks. And then after about 3 or 4 months, socks just started turning up at the office. These companies just started sending me socks, and I thought, there's something to this. So then I just slowly transitioned it into real estate. And I think it was only about a year later where I sold my first property through Instagram, and that would have been way back sort of 2015, purely just through Instagram.
So how did that happen? How did you sell a property through Instagram?
So I listed, at the time it was my highest priced property that I'd ever listed. The apartments I was selling were quite small, and that would have been sold for 1.24. And I just took a series of photos, I put them on my Instagram, and there was a local lady who followed me on Instagram. She sent it to her mum who lived in Dubai, and they purchased it sight unseen.
Wow. Did they go to a website, or did you have a website attached to you?
They just called me straight from those photos on Instagram, and we had that discussion. It was listed online, but they weren't actually looking on that portal.
Right.
So I just directed them to it, obviously answered the usual questions, and 3 weeks later we had a deal.
So was it listed online through realestate.com,
it was.
domain, or one of those?
Yeah, both.
Yeah, okay, both those. Okay, so basically you sent the hook out through Instagram. And
yeah, well, they weren't looking for real estate at the time.
They weren't?
Not actively. They knew they were moving back to Brisbane at some point, but it was just because the daughter was trying to bring them back quicker that she sent them those that Instagram post.
And so how many people you have on your Instagram now? Like what are your number of followers?
32,000, I think it is.
Yeah.
That's
a good number, especially for a real estate agent.
Yeah.
Not too many real estate agents have that.
Well, I think at the time it was probably 4,000, something around that.
Yeah. And what do you do on your Instagram now, these days, to your people who follow you? And what are they? What are these followers? Are they investors, or what are we talking about?
Look, I think a lot of the people who follow me are just interested in watching and looking and learning about real estate, which I think is natural, right? It's a very exciting, it's most people's biggest asset. So they want to know about it. They want to see what other people are buying and what's for sale and who's selling and who's buying. It's natural. So I would say the majority, well, I know this, the majority of my followers are local. Local as in Australian, and then local again as in Queensland and Brisbane. So I have a very large local following, which is great for what I'm trying to do, which is attract buyers, essentially, and those buyers turn into sellers down the track.
But do you use that, excuse me, do you use your buyer list, so to speak, to help convince a vendor that you will sell the property?
Not typically. It's not something that I go into a vendor meeting and sort of throw out there straight away, because more often than not, I know that they've already checked me out. It's only natural, right? If you're interviewing agents, especially with the homes that I sell at the higher end, typically they've done their research. So rather than just put it on their plate, I'll typically wait and they will bring it up and say, oh, you haven't spoken about your social media, which is great. I'd rather they did that than I put it on their plate.
So just tell me about Ascot then. I mean, Ascot that's where the races are, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. So tell me about Ascot. I mean, maybe take me over the last couple of years. Has it done something different? Has it changed? And where's the values? And what do you pay for an average house, apartment? What is it? Houses and apartments? What are we talking about?
Look, typically houses in Ascot.
Yep.
There are apartments, but there's not a great wealth of them. There are certain areas that are, high density. Ascot's one of the, it's one of the blue chip suburbs of Brisbane that everyone recognises.
Right.
So, these suburbs have had huge growth over the last few years. Hamilton, Ascot, Clayfield, and the surrounds. It's so close to the city. 4 kilometres positioned between the city and the airport, which is obviously of a huge benefit to a lot of people. Typically larger homes, higher priced homes, and certainly that growth has, over the last 10 months or a year, has just been explosive.
So I was looking on the CoreLogic data recently released, in fact this week, and it says in the national prices and across Australia haven't really gone up that much, and like a very, very marginal increase. But we're talking about averages, and we're talking about averages of all dwellings, that's houses and apartments and townhouses. But one thing that stuck out in my mind from that CoreLogic data was that both Sydney and Melbourne are holding the country back, because Sydney and Melbourne dwelling prices have decreased. But Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth have increased. And obviously it's an average for Brisbane, but why do you think that Brisbane is outperforming Sydney and Melbourne? What would you put that down to?
There's a few reasons. I think the obvious one is Brisbane had a lot of catching up to do. We're a global city now.
In what sense though?
I think prices have been restrained in Brisbane for a long, long time.
Right.
We haven't seen anywhere near the growth that the other capital cities have.
So it's affordable.
It's extremely affordable, and that's one of the key reasons that I don't see I don't see Brisbane going backwards in the next few years. And I know there's a lot of talk about that. The key economic drivers are just too strong. The buyers are just too attracted to Brisbane, the interstate buyers especially, for lifestyle, health and affordability reasons.
Do you mind explaining to me what the attractions are? For example, you said lifestyle, health. What do you mean by lifestyle?
I think a lot of the buyers that I'm dealing with now, especially those coming out of Melbourne and Sydney, are fast tracking the plans that they always had in the back of their head. I think COVID's shown that everyone can work from home. There's a lot more flexibility in the workplace. So they're sitting there saying, well, why are we going to continue doing this when our end goal was to get to, whether it be Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, why don't we just start looking up there now? And quite often when they do start looking, they buy very quickly.
But what's going through a person's mind, in your experience, that Brisbane, Gold Coast or Noosa or whatever is somewhere that they wanted to move to? Why do they want to move there? Is it because it's warmer or it's more chilled, or people like to hang out? What is it?
I think that as well, but there was a period last year, at the end of last year, October and November, where I think I sold 5 or 6 properties, all high-priced properties, completely sight unseen, each one to individual Melbourne buyers. And I think that's a very telling stat, because at that point in time, in October and November, the pain in Melbourne was so high.
Totally.
We weren't seeing any of those effects in October and November in Brisbane, and there was no end in sight with border openings. So we were just getting people call, some of them didn't even have a buyer's agent acting on their behalf, some of them weren't even looking via video calls, and they were just throwing money, sight unseen. A lot of it was cash unconditional. And then as soon as they announced the borders opening, that's when it pulled back a little bit, because the buyers think, well, we'll come up for Christmas, we'll bring the kids, we'll holiday, they enjoy the beach so much, and then they get on that sort of buyer cycle that can take 1 to 3 months.
Yeah, so you're saying that late last year, some of the reason people had this in mind to migrate or invest outside of Melbourne is because of all the COVID restrictions that were being layered over people who lived in Victoria for a long, long time. But there was probably a number of people, apart from that, there's probably a number of people who have this dream about living in Queensland. Like it's a great place. Is it just weather? I mean, is it a weather thing, do you think?
I think it's a slower pace as well. I mean, it's definitely a slower pace, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
But it is. Everything is so close, the traffic especially. Anywhere you need to get to, you can get, we're talking 10, 15 minutes. Whether it be the city, the airport, the Riverwalk, all the amenity that's close. That's why that inner hub of Brisbane is always going to do extremely well, no matter what happens with the market over the next 2 or 3 years, I believe. Is because we have so much demand from interstate. The interstate migration at the moment is nearly at all-time highs. And the housing coming to market, the product is not, so it's restricted supply, increased demand.
That's interesting. So you're getting population growth in Brisbane.
Massive.
We've probably had in Sydney, Melbourne, negative population growth. Melbourne in particular, a lot of it, as I saw the stats, has been migrated. People have left Melbourne, gone up to Queensland, and some to Sydney, but mostly up to Queensland. So how important is population growth to sustainable house price growth?
I think it's extremely important, as long as there's the employment market to sustain it. I think is very important. So when you look at, what have we got? The 2032 Olympics, that's within sight now.
One.
Billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that will bring over the course of the next 10 years. And I think that's very important. So again, there's a change in the market. It's happening right now. I think everyone's talking about it. But there's always change. There's never a state of equilibrium in the property market. It's in constant change. So it's about understanding that change and what's really driving Brisbane prices. And like I said, again, I really don't see that slowing down for Brisbane.
I've been a big believer, and I don't want to say I spooked, but I've talked it about buying in Brisbane for a long time now. And three of the things that I think are really important elements to underpin a sustained growth, as opposed to just being a flash in the pan, a pandemic flash. And I'd like you, if you wouldn't mind commenting, it's important. One is population growth because of, it doesn't really matter what it is. It could be lifestyle, it could be it's more chilled out, or it's less people, or it could be quicker to get from one place to another place. That helps lifestyle. It could be weather, but lifestyle in general. So Brisbane presents a lifestyle change. That's one. And I think that's one of the important variables. I think the second one is a really important one you just made, is Brisbane and any place where money is thrown into by federal or state governments, it doesn't make any difference, where money is being invested into, and we create a pool of dollars going to tradesmen, whoever it's going to, corporations, that money somehow finds its way into the real estate market, somehow. And I think that's a really important one. So population growth, lots of capital and or liquidity being thrown at a particular environment. And the third one, I think, is relative affordability. So Brisbane is, relatively speaking, very affordable compared to, say, Sydney, Melbourne. Probably it's much more expensive than Adelaide, but relative to Sydney, Melbourne. So it becomes attractive. Those three components are the things that I've always thought to myself, Brisbane's a great place to invest in or buy in. Would you like to give an opinion on those three aspects?
I think the most important one of those three aspects, or the one that stands out to me, although the first two are extremely important and I think more obvious, I think the third one, affordability, is something, because there are so many people right now saying it's unaffordable in Brisbane, but when you do compare it to the other states in Australia, I think it's extremely affordable. There are still homes you can buy well sub 1 million on a decent block that are very livable, very close to the city, a short commute. And to me, that's still extremely good. Or
relatively short commute. Relatively speaking, a short commute.
Well, mate, I've lived in Sydney before. It's a lot shorter of a commute than anywhere here.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Absolutely.
And what would you say is the threshold for a Brisbane person to qualify as a relatively short commute? So in other words, is it 45 minutes out of the city? Is that acceptable?
Such a great question, because we're spoilt in Brisbane. So the minute you start getting sort of that 15, 20 minutes, that's when buyers always say, oh, it's a bit too far, Drew.
Right.
And I'm sitting there saying, well, it's 15 or 20 minutes. It's not far at all.
But that's for your multi-million-dollar property. What about something that's a $700,000 property? What do you think the time constraint is now? We're talking about 45. I'll tell you what I say, because Moreton Bay, it's unbelievable. It's beautiful.
Yep.
I mean, there are a few parts aren't, like Deception Beach isn't perfect, but nonetheless, you still can buy something there for $700,000, like a house on a block of land. But they put the new freeway in there to Brisbane, and it's like a 45-minute commute or something, and I've driven up there and had a look. Does that sort of, to me, looks like it's pretty good buying, but what would you say? But is that, generally speaking, too far out?
I think this brings up another good point, which I was going to touch on anyway, which I am starting to see buyers cross that boundary in regards to they'll commute up to an hour. Different type of buyer to the one we were talking about before, who wants to be close to the city, but especially with many businesses now implementing work from home strategies and mandates. They are now taking that opportunity to say, well, if I can work from home 3 days a week, well, a commute an hour each way is not that bad if I get to live in my dream home, which is either on the coast or in the hinterland. And I can do that now rather than 10 or 20 years' time when I retire. So we are seeing, or I'm starting to see a trend where people are definitely doing that.
And they might be saying, I can still buy, and I can get a house on a block of land, which is like 10, 15 minutes from the beach, or from the, it's not the sea, but it's the, it's Moreton Bay, it's the bay, which is quite beautiful in some parts. I can still buy one of those for under $1 million.
Exactly.
So it
still
sort of
have money for a boat.
Yeah, and I can maybe upgrade my car, or I could do the kitchen up, or I could do something with it. You're saying you're starting to see movement towards those.
Starting to see movement towards that.
That's interesting, because I know a lot of people from Sydney who have bought properties up in that area to rent. To rent out, without even having gone there. They just bought it on the telephone, but bought it online, so to speak. Not through Instagram, but they've looked at the plans on realestate.com or whatever it is, and they've gone to the agent and they bid and they bought it. And I'm wondering whether or not you're seeing something emerge out of that. I mean, is this a new style of buyer?
It is a new style of buyer. Well, it's not a new style of buyer. It is a buyer who is now changing their strategy based on the fact that they can work from home. That's what I'm seeing in my price range that I typically sell in. But there's a lot of different, I guess, things that are emerging, especially in the suburbs that I work in, which have had explosive growth because they are those blue chip suburbs. So the minute a Melbourne or a Sydney buyer engages a buyer's agent, that's typically where they're funneled towards, these growth areas, these blue chip suburbs, Hamilton, Ascot, Clayfield. So we are seeing those buyers now want a more contemporary product rather than these older stately homes on very large blocks with tennis courts. Now these buyers are wanting smaller, lower maintenance blocks, bigger houses, but contemporary homes. And they're very hard to come by because there's not a lot of land that can be developed in these suburbs. So that is driving price rapidly.
So if I said to you, Drew, here's a $2 million, okay? Would you say to me, Mark, buy two $1 million properties somewhere, like some area, and which area? I'd like to ask you which area. Would you say, Mark, go and buy a $2 million property? Go and
buy a $2 million property.
Not two $1 million.
Not two $1 million
and
properties.
And sort of what area would you be saying?
I just had someone come to me 2 weeks ago with that exact same requirement. Said, I've got $2 million, what should I buy? I said, you should buy something on the hill with a view.
On the hill, sorry, where's
on
it?
Hamilton Hill. View of the city. They're rapidly becoming extinct in that price range. And I dare say I've probably sold them, at 1.925, probably one of the last properties that'll ever sell with a view that spectacular.
Is it a house?
Under $2 million. House on a small block.
House on a small block in Hamilton?
On Hamilton Hill.
Overlooking the city. Is it?
Overlooking the city.
That's near the river, is it?
Yeah, you can see parts of the river from there as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So, and I want to finish off with one wrap for you. Did you sell some record apartment or something like that?
A house?
A house?
Yeah, recently.
Recently.
Tell
me about
so that was... that's a product done by Zephyr Industries, which is a very well-known developer in our suburbs. We sold them a block maybe, 18 months ago in 810. They split it. They put two products side by side.
Two houses,
nearly identical. They are standalone. One's obviously themed white, one's black. And we have now sold, unconditional done, the number 8 Ludlow Street, which does set a record anywhere in Brisbane for any product on a small block.
Can you just share with me your first acquisition, your first foray into the property market?
Yeah, I can, because I remember it very, very clearly. I had a heavily pregnant wife, and selling real estate, it takes a lot of my time. So there were so many requests from my wife, Bri, come through this home, and I never saw any of them. And it got to the point where she was about 30 days away from giving birth, and she just said, you get to this home, we're buying it. So I turned up, registered, and the first bid that got thrown out exceeded my budget by about $50,000. So you get in the car, and I knew I was going to cop it, and I did. So I bring up realestate.com, found a home. I was like, auctions in half an hour, let's go here. Got there late. I literally walked through the backyard, under the house. It was a Queenslander that had been raised but hadn't been built in under. Walked through the house into the backyard. He gave me my ticket, and I just stood in the backyard with my hand up until I bought it. $687,500, and I think that was a big price at the time for that home. It was a tiny, tiny workers' cottage. I just did not care. I just did not want to deal with the pain. But a great learning curve, because it's so funny. I see that every week. Every week, I'll see someone walk through the door, and it's a pregnant wife and a husband with his head in his hand, and I feel it.
And then, did you do well out of it?
No, not really. Look, I didn't lose money. I made probably $30,000, which allowed me to leverage into my next home, which we built, which is really nice, and we're really happy there. So it gave me enough to take that next step within, I think we were in that home for 3 years.
Finally, what's your prognosis for business? Brisbane property business, in other words, buying property and or holding property, because everyone keeps talking about interest rates and blah, 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 elections and every other damn thing. What is your prognosis for real estate in Brisbane?
That's a good question. There is a lot of negativity in the market at the moment, but never in my career have I ever had a buyer turn around and say, I'm glad I waited to purchase. Never. So
that's a good point.
Genuinely. So I think if you're in a position where you can buy, just do as much as you can to put yourself in a position of strength. Be ready and prepared to offer immediately and competitively, and also be willing to make compromise. Because we see time and time again, buyers who come into the market at the start of their buyer cycle, they'll find 2 or 3 properties that really suited them, but then they'll miss out on them because they don't think they found the right property, and 3 months later they say, should have bought that property. You have to be willing to make compromise.
So that means meet the market.
Meet the market. But more than anything, don't hold back, because everyone who's held back over the last 2 years, I have a client, 2 years ago had a budget of 1.85, very nearly sold them into something. They said, we're just going to wait. They're still looking to buy with that same 1.85, but they can only buy half of what they could 2 years ago.
I think that's a good point. I think if you can afford to buy, if you've got the money, you can afford to buy, and you find the place you like, buy it.
Exactly, why not? I mean, obviously factor in interest rates going up, but it's still extremely affordable right now.
Drew, just on that point, factor interest rates going up, I'll be honest with you, lenders factor that in for you anyway.
Yeah, of course. They stress test it.
The lender's already going to add 2% to it. And, if interest rates go up by another 2%, you're already covered in terms of what they consider to be your affordability.
Yeah.
And they're usually tougher on your affordability than you are yourself. So I would, for me, if you can afford it, you've got a loan approved, you like it, you like the joint.
Yep.
Don't wait for some magic that you're going to arbitrage the market and outsmart everybody. You're not. Markets are perfect. Markets always outsmart all of us. So just drop the hammer and do it.
I couldn't agree more.
Drew, thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mark.
You're welcome.